My grandmother taught me that every plant has two faces, one that heals and one that harms. For years, I've used that knowledge to keep the people of Oakhaven safe. But my remedies were meant for human ailments, fevers, infections, broken bones. They were never meant for the monsters beyond the woods, the Silverhounds. Whispers of the sickness came on the autumn wind, a chilling rumor of a plague that left even the strongest werewolves gasping for air, their legendary strength turning to dust. They said it was a rot that started in the bones, a curse that was even wasting away their king. They were a nightmare made of tooth and claw, a threat we kept at a distance with superstition and iron fences. I never thought their suffering would be my concern, until the night that nightmare came bleeding to my door, its shadow falling over me. I never imagined it would come for me. The village of Oakhaven was nestled in a valley, cradled by the gnarled arms of an ancient forest. It was a place of quiet routines and deep-seated superstitions, chief among them being a healthy fear of their neighbors. The Silverhound pack, whose territory began where the woods grew too dark, were a constant silent presence. For generations, an uneasy truce held. The wolves did not hunt the villagers, and the villagers did not stray from the marked paths. But that truce was now stretched thin, strained not by aggression, but by an unnerving silence that felt far more dangerous. Inside her small, herb-scented cottage, Isolde ground dried feverfew into a fine powder. At 20, she was the village's unofficial healer, her knowledge of botanicals passed down from a mother she barely remembered. The work was usually a soothing rhythm, but today it did nothing to quiet the anxiety coiling in her gut. The whispers had started a week ago, brought by hunters who'd ventured too close to the border. They spoke of an unnatural stillness from the wolves' lands. Then came Old Man Hemlock, his face pale, claiming to have seen a wolf stumble near the riverbank, gaunt, its fur matted, its breath coming in ragged pants before it collapsed. A plague. That was the word spreading through Oakhaven like a contagion itself, a sickness that could fell a creature as formidable as a werewolf. Isolde paused, her gaze drifting to the rain-streaked window. She wasn't afraid for the wolves, not precisely. They were a danger, a force of nature to be respected. Yet, as a healer, the thought of any suffering felt like a personal failure. More practically, she knew a wounded animal was a desperate one. A pack ravaged by sickness, its alpha king rumored to be afflicted, was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The day bled into a damp, dreary evening. The rain became a torrent, drumming against her thatched roof. Isolde lit a tallow candle, its warm light pushing back the gloom, and settled by the hearth. She tried to lose herself in a worn book on herbal lore, but the quiet from the forest was a living thing, pressing in on all sides. The fire crackled. The rain lashed against the windows. Then, another sound cut through the storm. 3 heavy, deliberate knocks struck her door, the force vibrating through the floorboards. Isolde froze, her heart leaping into her throat. No villager would be out in this deluge. The knock came again, heavier this time, a resonant thump-thump-thump that held no patience and promised immense power. Slowly she rose, her hands trembling. She didn't dare look through the shutter. Her bare feet were silent on the cold stone floor as she approached the thick oak door. Taking a shaky breath, she wrapped her fingers around the cold, iron latch. Who could possibly be out there? She pulled. The latch clicked, and the heavy door groaned open a few inches, letting in a gust of wind and the scent of wet earth, pine, and something else. Something wild, predatory, and overcome with sickness. The scent hit her first, a thick, coppery smell of blood mixed with the feverish odor of infection, all carried on the wind and rain. The door swung inward, revealing the source. He was immense, forced to stoop in the frame of her doorway, his broad shoulders filling the entire space. It was a man, yet not. His features were hard, angular, and his drenched hair was the color of wet stone. But it was his eyes that held her captive, a brilliant, burning gold, filled not with malice, but with a desperate, hunted exhaustion. A deep, ragged gash ran from his temple down his jaw, sluggishly weeping blood that he seemed not to notice. He was one of them. A werewolf. Isolde's breath caught, her hand still frozen on the door's latch. Every instinct screamed at her to slam it shut, but she was mesmerized by the raw urgency in his gaze. He took a half-step forward, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that was barely audible over the storm. "You are the healer? The one who knows the old ways?" She could only manage a stiff nod, her throat too tight for words. "Our pack is dying," he continued, the words torn from him. "The sickness. It takes the strong first. It is a rot in the blood, a fire in the lungs. Our own healers are gone or afflicted. Nothing we do can stop it." He swayed slightly, placing a hand the size of a dinner plate against the doorframe to steady himself. The wood groaned under the pressure. His desperation was a palpable force, thick and suffocating in the small space. "Why come to me?" Isolde finally whispered, finding her voice. We are not allies." The werewolf's golden eyes seemed to pierce right through her, laying bare the healer's soul she tried to hide behind a villager's fear. "Because the sickness has taken the heart of our pack, it has taken our alpha." He leaned closer, the intensity of his plea blocking out the world. "The king is dying, healer. Lysander is dying. The whispers of your skill reached our ears long ago. You are our last hope." The name struck her like a physical blow. Lysander. The Alpha King. A figure of terrifying legend. The powerful ruler who kept the uneasy peace. If he fell, the chaos that followed would undoubtedly spill across the border and drown Oakhaven. The werewolf saw the understanding dawn on her face. He took another step, crossing the threshold into her home. "You will come with me," he said, his voice no longer pleading. It was a statement of grim, absolute necessity. "You will come now." His command hung in the air, as heavy and oppressive as the storm outside. For a paralyzing moment, Isolde was torn between two primal fears: the monster before her and the catastrophic collapse of the world she knew if his king died. Refusing him felt like a death sentence, but going with him felt like walking willingly into her own grave. It was her healer's instinct that broke the paralysis. A sickness was a sickness, a patient was a patient, and a healer did not stand idle. More than that, a dying pack was a rabid animal, and Oakhaven was right in its path. Curing them was not just an act of mercy, it was an act of self-preservation. She lifted her chin, her gaze meeting his without flinching. "I will not be commanded," she stated, her voice surprisingly steady. The werewolf's brow furrowed in confusion, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "I will help," Isolde continued, pressing her advantage before he could object. "But I will do so on my own terms. There are conditions." The sheer audacity of her statement seemed to stun him into silence. She took a breath and laid out her price. "First, you will guarantee my safety. I am to be considered an ally, not a prisoner. No harm will come to me from you or any of your pack." He stared at her, his golden eyes narrowed. "Second," she said, her voice gaining strength, "my methods are my own. Your pack will not interfere with my work. I will have the freedom to gather what I need and administer remedies as I see fit, without question. And third," she finished, driving the bargain home, "when my work is done, whether the king lives or dies, you will return me to this cottage, unharmed. Those are my terms. Agree to them, and I am yours to guide. Refuse, and you can find another healer." The silence stretched, broken only by the rain and the werewolf's ragged breathing. He studied her, a flicker of something new in his eyes. Not respect, perhaps, but a grudging acknowledgement of her spirit. He had come expecting a terrified human he would have to drag into the woods. He had found something else entirely. Finally, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Your terms are accepted, on my life." Relief, cold and sharp, washed through Isolde. She had just bound a monster to his word. "Good," she said, turning to grab her healer's satchel from its peg. "Then I will need to pack my supplies." "There is no time," the werewolf rumbled from her doorway, his voice once again tight with urgency. He jerked his head toward the raging storm and the impenetrable darkness of the forest beyond. "The alpha fades with every breath we waste. Gather only what you can carry. We leave now." Stepping over her threshold was like crossing into another world. The familiar comfort of her cottage was gone, replaced by the wild, violent embrace of the storm. The werewolf, who introduced himself as Kale, moved with a speed and silence that was unnatural for his size, forcing Isolde into a half-jog to keep up. He led her away from the village paths, plunging into the deep woods where the trees grew into a thick, suffocating canopy that blocked out the sky. The very air grew heavier, charged with a primal energy that made the hairs on her arms stand up. This was their land. The border had been crossed. After what felt like hours, the terrain shifted. They climbed a rocky incline, and the trees opened into a vast, natural clearing, sheltered by a towering cliff face. A series of deep caves dotted the rock wall, their entrances lit by the flickering orange glow of torches. This was the Silverhound den. Figures emerged from the shadows and the cave mouths, their forms large and imposing. A wave of raw hostility washed over Isolde, more chilling than the rain. Growls rumbled through the clearing as dozens of golden eyes fixed on her, filled with suspicion and naked animosity. They were desperate, but their hatred for a human intruder was a fire that even their desperation couldn't quench. One figure detached himself from the others, striding forward to meet them. He was even larger than Kale, with a fierce, grim face and a mantle of authority that was absolute. Scars marked his face, and his eyes held no trace of Kale's desperate plea, only cold, hard judgment. "Kale!" the newcomer snarled, his voice like grinding stones. "What is this? You dare bring a human into our den?" "Thane, she is the healer," Kale replied, stepping partially in front of Isolde. "She is our only chance." The beta, Thane, scoffed, his gaze sweeping over Isolde with undisguised contempt. He took a deliberate step forward, closing the distance until he loomed over her. The sheer predatory power rolling off him was staggering. He was the pack's enforcer, its second in command, and he looked at her as if she were a disease herself. A fragile human twig to save an alpha king? Thane's lips curled back from his teeth. She will do more harm than good. He leaned down, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that cut through the howl of the wind. "You do not belong here, little healer." He paused, letting the threat sink in, his eyes promising a swift and brutal end. "One wrong move, and I will personally tear you apart." Thane's threat hung in the air, a palpable promise of violence. Before Isolde could even formulate a response, Kale stepped forward, placing a hand on his beta's shoulder. "She came on her own terms, Thane. I gave my word. The Alpha. He is worse." The name of his king was the only thing that could break Thane's murderous focus. A flicker of pain crossed the beta's harsh features. With a final venomous glare at Isolde, he stepped aside, the wall of muscle and fury clearing her path. "If he dies because of your human filth," he growled, "your end will be slow." Isolde ignored him, her focus narrowing to the task ahead. She followed Kale into the largest of the caves. The air inside was thick with the scent of sickness, wet fur, and despair. The chamber was vast, the stone walls lit by torches that cast dancing, monstrous shadows. In the center of the cavern, on a raised platform covered in thick furs, lay the Alpha King. Even ravaged by illness, he was magnificent. Lysander was larger than any of them, his body a study in honed, lethal power. His hair, the color of dark silver, was matted with sweat against his brow. His bare chest and arms were covered in the faded lines of old scars, each a testament to a battle won. A powerful, honorable soul, she had sensed from the whispers, and seeing him now, she knew it was true. His presence filled the cave, a formidable weight even in his unconscious state. Isolde approached the platform, her healer's instincts taking over and pushing her fear aside. She placed her satchel on the stone floor and knelt beside him. His skin was scorching hot to the touch, and his breathing was shallow, a faint wheezing sound rattling in his chest. This was no ordinary fever. She leaned closer, examining the texture of his skin, searching for any rash or sign. As her fingers brushed against the pulse point on his neck, she detected something else beneath the overwhelming scent of fever, a faint, acrid, unnatural smell, like bitter almonds and rot. It was a scent she'd only read about in the oldest, most forbidden texts. It was the signature of a magically infused poison. This wasn't a plague. It was an attack. As the shocking realization solidified in her mind, she leaned nearer to his face, trying to catch the scent on his breath. Suddenly, his eyes snapped open. They were not the clear, intelligent gold of Kale or Thane's, but a clouded, fever-bright yellow. He wasn't truly seeing her. It was a primal, fever-driven reflex. But the raw, possessive power in that momentary gaze locked onto hers, and for a heart-stopping second, she felt like prey caught in the sights of a beast. The connection shattered as quickly as it had formed. Lysander's eyelids fluttered shut, his head falling back against the furs, leaving Isolde breathless and trembling. The raw power she had felt in that brief, fevered gaze was unlike anything she had ever encountered. It was ancient, possessive, and absolute. It solidified her new certainty. This was no natural plague. This was an assassination attempt, and she was the only one who knew it. Shaking off the lingering shock, she turned to her satchel, her movements now filled with a new, fierce urgency. The pack watched her, a ring of resentful, golden-eyed statues in the torchlight. Thane's hostile glare was the most potent, a physical weight on her shoulders. She ignored them all. Her patient was the only thing that mattered. She worked quickly, crushing a chunk of willow bark for the fever and adding a fine black powder of purified charcoal. To this, she mixed in the mashed roots of milk thistle, a potent herb known to combat the deadliest of toxins. The result was a dark, gritty paste. "What is that?" Thane's voice was a low snarl, dripping with suspicion. "What human filth are you smearing on our king?" "It is a poultice to draw the poison," Isolde replied without looking up, her tone sharp and clinical. "And a tincture to fight the fever. Now, unless you are a healer, I suggest you remain silent and let me work." A menacing growl answered her, but before Thane could move, Kale put a restraining arm on his beta's chest. "You heard her terms, Thane. We do nothing." With painstaking care, Isolde applied the cool paste to Lysander's chest, directly over his heart. Then came the harder part. With Kale's help, she managed to pry the alpha's jaw open enough to pour a thin stream of bitter, fever-reducing liquid down his throat. Most of it dribbled out, but she prayed some had made it down. Then, the waiting began. The hours stretched into an eternity, marked only by the sputtering of the torches and the ragged rhythm of the king's breathing. Isolde never left his side, periodically wiping his brow with a cloth dipped in cool water. The air in the cavern was thick with tension, a suffocating blanket of barely suppressed violence. Every wolf watched her, waiting for her to fail. Just as the first hint of pre-dawn light threatened to gray the cavern entrance, she felt it. A subtle shift. Lysander's breathing, once shallow and erratic, deepened into a steadier, more even cadence. The violent shivering that had racked his powerful frame subsided into a mere tremor. Hesitantly, Isolde placed the back of her hand against his forehead. The skin was still hot, far too hot, but the raging, infernal heat had lessened. The fever had broken its peak. A collective sigh seemed to pass through the assembled wolves. The low growling that had been a constant hum finally subsided. It was a small victory, a fragile glimmer of hope in the suffocating dark. Exhaustion suddenly hit her like a physical blow, and she sagged against the platform, her head bowed for just a moment. As she did, a hand shot out from the furs and clamped around her wrist. Isolde cried out in surprise, her head snapping up. Lysander's eyes were still closed, his face slack in unconsciousness, but his grip was like an iron manacle. It wasn't a thrashing, feverish movement. It was a deliberate, possessive capture, and she was utterly, terrifyingly trapped. Lysander's grip was unyielding, an iron band around her wrist that held her prisoner. Isolde tugged gently at first, then with more force, but his hand might as well have been fused to hers. It wasn't violent. There was no malice in it, only an unbreakable, unconscious hold. He was still deep in the throes of fever, his breathing heavy and even, but that powerful hand seemed to possess a will of its own. Thane, who had been watching from a distance, took a menacing step forward, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Leave her be, human," he snarled, misinterpreting the situation. "He won't release me," Isolde whispered, her voice strained. "He's still unconscious." Kale, ever watchful, stepped in. "It's the sickness, Thane. He clings to her as he clings to life." He motioned for the beta to back down, and with a frustrated grunt, Thane retreated, though his golden eyes never left Isolde. Resigned, Isolde settled back down beside the Alpha King. His skin was still radiating heat, but it was a more bearable warmth now. The pulse under his strong fingers on her wrist was steady, albeit slow. As the long hours of the night wore on, a strange calm settled over her. With the immediate danger of his fever breaking, a different kind of vigil began. The surrounding wolves had mostly retreated into the shadows of the cave, leaving her and Lysander in a small, torchlit pool of quiet. She began to speak, her voice a soft murmur in the cavern. She wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was the strange intimacy of his unconscious grip. Perhaps it was the desperate loneliness she felt in this hostile den. She spoke of Oakhaven, of the small joys of working in her herb garden, of the satisfaction of a successfully brewed remedy. She confessed her fears, the trepidation she felt about being among the Silverhounds, and the terrifying responsibility of holding their king's life in her hands. "I don't know if I can save you, Alpha King," she whispered, her gaze tracing the strong line of his jaw. "This sickness. It feels like it's been woven with dark threads, but I will try. I promise you that much." She talked about her mother, a fleeting memory of soft hands and the smell of lavender. She even shared a small, secret hope to find a place where her knowledge was valued, not just tolerated. In the deepest hours of the night, with the packs breathing a faint, distant hum and the rain still whispering outside the cave, Isolde felt a connection she never thought possible. It was one-sided, perhaps, but profoundly real. She was pouring her heart out to a sleeping wolf, a king who was both her captor and her patient, and in his silent, possessive grip, she found a strange, unexpected comfort. As the sky outside began to lighten, promising a new day, Isolde finally drifted into an exhausted sleep, her hand still held firmly in the Alpha King's powerful grasp. Isolde awoke with a jolt, the unfamiliar stiffness in her neck reminding her of her strange bed. Lysander's hand had finally relaxed its grip on her wrist, though it still rested heavily beside her own on the furs. The cavern was brighter, filled with the muted light of morning. She stretched, her muscles aching, but a renewed sense of purpose invigorated her. The Alpha King's fever was lower, his breathing deeper. He was not out of danger, but he was undeniably better. Her work, however, was far from over. Her mind kept circling back to the acrid, bitter scent she'd detected, the telltale sign of magical poison. She needed to confirm her suspicions, and that meant exploring. Specifically, she needed to examine their water source. She slipped quietly from the cavern, careful not to disturb the few sleeping wolves. The air outside was cool and damp after the rain, smelling of wet earth and pine. Kyle was nowhere to be seen, likely resting, and Thane was nowhere near her path. She moved swiftly, her healer's satchel slung over her shoulder, following the faint sounds of running water. The scent of poison, though subtle, seemed to grow stronger the deeper she went into the forest, guiding her like an invisible thread. She found the spring tucked away in a small, moss-covered grotto, its waters bubbling up from beneath ancient stones. It was clearly the pack's primary source of fresh water, a place of peace and natural beauty. But as Isolde knelt by the edge, her eyes immediately caught the telltale signs. A thin, iridescent film shimmered on the surface of the pool, almost invisible to the untrained eye, and a ring of the surrounding moss and ferns was discolored, brittle, and dying, as if scorched by an unseen fire. She dipped a finger into the cool water, then brought it to her nose. The faint, bitter almond scent was undeniably present, mixed with a metallic tang. This was it. Someone had intentionally poisoned the Silverhound pack's water supply. This wasn't a random illness. It was a deliberate act of sabotage, an attack designed to cripple their alpha and decimate his warriors. The realization sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the damp air. This changed everything. She was no longer just a healer treating a sickness. She was in the middle of a conflict, standing on the evidence of a betrayal. She quickly collected a sample of the water in a small vial, then surveyed the surrounding area, searching for any other clues. Her gaze caught on a scattering of strange, small, dark beads near the edge of the grotto, almost hidden by damp leaves. They were obsidian smooth, unlike anything natural. Isolde carefully picked one up. It hummed with a faint, dark energy that prickled her skin. These were not simply beads. They were residue, a magical trace left behind. Someone wanted the Silverhounds dead, and they had used dark magic to achieve it. The true danger had just begun. Isolde returned to the main cavern, her heart pounding with the weight of her discovery. The vial of tainted water and the dark bead felt heavy in her satchel, evidence of a treachery far more insidious than a simple sickness. She had to tell Kale, or Thane, but she also knew the potential for chaos her news could unleash. A traitor in the den, attacking their alpha from within, would ignite a brutal hunt. She found Lysander's condition had improved further. His breathing was stronger, deeper, and the lines of pain on his face had eased. The color was returning to his lips, though his skin remained too pale. He looked less like a dying man and more like a warrior in deep, exhausted sleep. The pack members who had been keeping vigil now seemed less agitated, a flicker of guarded hope in their eyes. Isolde knelt beside him again, her attention solely on her patient. She prepared another round of the charcoal and milk thistle paste, this time adding a powerful immune-boosting herb she had found in the grotto, untouched by the poison. As she carefully applied the new poultice to his chest, she felt a subtle shift in his body. A faint tremor ran through his powerful frame. Then, his chest rose with a deep, shuddering breath, a sound that pulled oxygen deep into his lungs. His eyelids fluttered. Isolde froze, her hand hovering just inches from his skin. The surrounding wolves, sensing the change, stilled, their golden eyes fixing on their alpha king with bated breath. Slowly, agonizingly, Lysander's eyes opened. They were no longer the clouded, fever-bright yellow. They were a brilliant, piercing gold, like molten amber, filled with an ancient intelligence that was both terrifying and utterly captivating. His gaze swept around the cavern, taking in his pack, the familiar stone, and then, with breathtaking slowness, it settled on Isolde. A gasp escaped her lips. His eyes, though still heavy-lidded, were clear. He saw her, truly saw her. And in that moment, as his gaze met hers, a jolt of raw, primal energy surged between them. It was like a lightning strike, a sudden, undeniable connection that hummed deep in her bones, startling her to the core. It was possessive, powerful, and entirely unexpected. His hand, which had been resting loosely by his side, slowly, deliberately, reached out. His fingers, warm and strong, gently closed around her wrist, just as they had in his fevered sleep. This time, there was no fever. This was conscious, purposeful. His thumb stroked the sensitive skin of her inner wrist, a silent, intimate gesture. His golden eyes, though still weary, held hers in an unbreakable lock, filled with an intensity that promised a profound, inescapable claim. The moment stretched, electric with unspoken recognition. Then, with a faint, almost imperceptible sigh, his thumb continued its slow, possessive caress. He knew her, and she suddenly knew, with chilling certainty, that her life was about to change forever. The touch was a brand, searing a silent recognition into Isolde's very soul. Lysander's golden eyes, no longer dulled by the sickness, held hers with an intensity that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. There was no confusion in his gaze, no lingering fog of fever, only a potent, unwavering focus, as if she were the single most important thing in his newly reawakened world. The hum of raw, primal energy between them intensified, pulling her deeper into his orbit. He said nothing, yet his eyes spoke volumes. They conveyed a primal gratitude, yes, but also a fierce, possessive claim that stole her breath. It was the look of a predator who had found his prey, but instead of hunger, it held a profound, undeniable recognition. It was as if he had always known she would be here, saving him, and now that he was awake, he was simply confirming a truth that had always existed. The cavern was silent, the entire pack holding its collective breath, watching their alpha king. Thane stood rigid, his face a mask of disbelief and anger. Kyle, however, watched with a strange mixture of awe and dawning understanding. No one moved, no one dared to speak. The air crackled with the sheer force of Lysander's reawakened presence. He tightened his grip on her wrist, a gentle but firm assertion of his will. His thumb continued to stroke, a silent, rhythmic caress that sent shivers down her spine. Isolde felt a blush creep up her neck, a foreign heat that had nothing to do with the cave's temperature. She was acutely aware of every wolf's gaze on them, but she couldn't tear her own eyes away from Lysander's. He lifted his other hand, a slow, deliberate movement that spoke of immense, returning strength. His fingers, scarred and powerful, reached up and gently, almost reverently, brushed a stray strand of hair from her face. The simple touch was feather-light, yet it held the weight of a solemn declaration. It was an intimacy that went beyond healer and patient, beyond human and wolf. It was something deeper, something fated. Lysander then closed his eyes again, but his grip on her wrist remained. He was not falling back into unconsciousness. He was simply resting, drawing on her presence, solidifying this new, profound awareness. But before his eyes fully closed, his lips parted slightly. The sound was a mere whisper, a guttural rasp that seemed to vibrate through the very stone of the cave, yet it filled the silence with absolute authority. Mine, the word echoed in the sudden, deafening silence of the cavern. Mine. It was a sound of pure, guttural possession, a claim staked with chilling authority. Isolde stared at Lysander, her mind reeling. His golden eyes were still fixed on her, unwavering, as if they were the only two beings in the universe. But they were not alone. The fragile piece of the den shattered into 100 pieces. A cacophony of snarls and furious growls erupted from the assembled wolves. The sound was a physical wave of aggression that made Isolde flinch. Thane was the first to find his voice, his face a mask of incandescent rage. Alpha, you are still weak from the fever. You don't know what you are saying. She is a human. The word human was a curse, spat onto the stone floor. Others joined in, a chorus of dissent. "An outsider cannot be mate to the Alpha King," an older wolf growled. "It is against all laws of the pack." Chaos threatened to consume the cavern. Through it all, Lysander's grip on Isolde's wrist remained, a warm, immovable anchor. With a slowness that belied the immense power behind the movement, he pushed himself up, his back straight, his regal authority returning with every breath. He was still gaunt from his illness, but the sheer force of his presence was enough to quiet the immediate uproar. His gaze swept over his pack, each wolf flinching as his eyes met theirs. The golden fire in them was no longer soft with recognition for Isolde. It was the hard, commanding blaze of a king. "I know precisely what I am saying," he stated, his voice raspy but carrying to every corner of the chamber. He looked back at Isolde, his expression softening only for her. "She is my mate. The bond is already settled." He was not asking for their approval. He was informing them of an unchangeable fact. The finality in his tone sent a fresh wave of horror and rage through Isolde. This wasn't gratitude. This wasn't a reward. This was a declaration of ownership. He was claiming her, like a prize won in a battle against death. Everything she had fought for, her independence, her right to choose her own path, was being stripped away by a single possessive word. The healer's calm fell away, replaced by the fire of a woman cornered. She wrenched her wrist, but his grip was like stone. Her eyes, as fierce as his, met his gaze. "I am not a possession," she snapped, her voice ringing out in the tense silence. "I am not yours. I belong to no one." A collective gasp went through the pack. The sheer audacity of a human defying their alpha king, who had just risen from the edge of death, was unthinkable. The cavern fell into a shocked, dangerous silence. Lysander's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise, and something akin to intrigued admiration, crossing his features. He seemed less offended by her defiance than fascinated by it. Before he could respond, 3 older wolves, their muzzles grayed with age, stepped forward from the shadows. Their bearing was stoic, their faces etched with the gravity of their position as the pack's elders. The one in the center, a grizzled wolf with a scarred eye, bowed his head stiffly to Lysander. "Alpha King," he began, his voice a dry rustle of ancient authority. "The law is the law. It has guided the Silverhound pack for 1,000 years. Our bloodline must remain pure. A human cannot be Luna. She cannot bear a true heir. She cannot lead the pack in a shift. She is lesser." The insult stung, but Isolde held her ground, her chin held high. "She saved your lives." Lysander's voice was dangerously quiet, a low rumble that promised a storm. "She performed a service for which she will be greatly rewarded," the elder countered, unswayed. "But a mate bond with a human is a fiction, an illusion of the fever. It must be renounced." Thane stepped forward, aligning himself with the elders. "He speaks the truth, my king. The pack will not accept this. It will sow weakness and dissent. It will be an invitation for our enemies to strike." Lysander slowly pushed himself to his feet. He was unsteady, leaning a hand against the stone platform for support, yet he seemed to grow in stature until he dominated the cavern once more. He drew a deep breath, and when he spoke, his voice was imbued with the chilling, absolute power of the Alpha Command, a force that bent the will of lesser wolves. "Enough." The single word struck them all like a physical blow. The elders recoiled. Thane clenched his jaw but fell silent. Every wolf in the cavern lowered their head in submission, the instinct to obey their alpha overriding their dissent. The power in the room was suffocating. Lysander's gaze swept over them all, his authority unquestionable. "Your concerns have been noted," he said, his voice returning to normal, though no less commanding. "They will be addressed, but they will be addressed by me, and me alone." He then turned his gaze to the cave entrance. "Now, all of you, leave us." No one argued. The elders bowed stiffly and retreated. Thane shot one last hateful glare at Isolde before turning and stalking out. One by one, the rest of the pack filed out of the cavern, their silent obedience a testament to their king's power. Soon the great chamber was empty, leaving Isolde utterly alone with the wolf who had just silenced an entire pack to claim her. The silence that descended was heavier than the previous chaos. Isolde stood rigid, her arms crossed defensively over her chest, watching as Lysander carefully lowered himself back onto the furs. He looked exhausted, the brief exertion of his authority having cost him dearly, but his golden eyes were sharp and focused entirely on her. "The bond between mates is not about ownership, Isolde," he began, his voice softer now, stripped of command. "It is a recognition of the soul. When I was lost in the fever, in the darkness, you were the only light. My wolf knew you before I did. It is a sacred, unbreakable tie. It is destiny." "It is a cage," she shot back, her voice trembling with barely controlled fury. "My destiny is my own to decide, not something to be dictated by your wolf's instincts." He sighed, a weary sound. "I understand your fear. Your world and mine are not the same." He saw the wall of defiance in her eyes and seemed to realize that words of fate and magic would not sway her. He needed to give her a reason to trust him, a reason beyond this mystical bond she didn't believe in. This was her chance. "Before we speak of destiny, let's speak of reality," Isolde said, reaching into her satchel. She pulled out the vial of tainted water and the small, dark obsidian bead, placing them on the stone platform between them. "Your pack is not suffering from a plague, Your Majesty. You are being poisoned." Lysander's eyes narrowed, his focus shifting instantly from her to the objects. He leaned forward, his weariness forgotten, and carefully picked up the obsidian bead. A low, dangerous growl rumbled deep in his chest as his fingers closed around it. "This is shadow magic," he murmured, his voice laced with cold fury. "Dark. Forbidden." "The spring that feeds your den has been tainted," Isolde explained, her voice all business now. "And this bead. I believe it's a magical trace left by whoever did it. This was a deliberate, calculated attack." He looked up at her, and for the first time, she saw him not as a king or a possessive mate, but as a leader whose people were under siege. He saw her, too, in a new light, not as a fragile human or a fated prize, but as a sharp, intelligent mind. He saw an ally. "You are more than a healer," he said, a note of awe in his voice. He extended his hand, palm up, not to grab her, but as an offering. "My pack is threatened from within. My authority is challenged. I cannot do this alone. I need a partner, someone whose eyes see things that ours do not. Help me, Isolde. Help me find the traitor who did this. Be my ally, and I swear on my life, I will treat you as my equal, not as a possession." Isolde stared at his outstretched hand, scarred and powerful. The hand of a king. He was offering her a choice, a partnership. It was a terrifying prospect, but it was also the only path that offered her a measure of control over her own fate. Isolde looked from Lysander's outstretched hand to the fierce determination in his eyes. He was offering her a role, not just a title. He was offering her purpose within this dangerous new world. Taking a slow, deliberate breath, she placed her hand in his. His skin was warm, his grip firm and reassuring. It was the sealing of a pact. "I will help you," she said, her voice clear and strong. A wave of relief washed over Lysander's face. "Thank you." He gently released her hand and gestured to the obsidian bead still resting on the furs. "The scent on this, it is faint, masked by the dark magic, but it is there. It is the scent of one of my own, layered with the scent of rot and shadow." He closed his eyes, concentrating. "I know it, but my mind is still weak from the fever. I cannot place the face. We need someone who knows the pack's routines, Isolde reasoned. Someone who would notice if a pack member was acting strangely or was somewhere they shouldn't be. Someone whose loyalty to you is absolute, even if they hate me. There was only one answer. Thane, Lysander breathed. He let out a sharp, commanding bark that echoed through the cavern. Moments later, the beta appeared at the entrance, his expression wary and grim. He looked from his alpha to Isolde, his jaw tight with disapproval, but he approached and bowed his head. You called, my king? Thane, I need your senses and your memory, Lysander said, his voice regaining its regal tone. He explained Isolde's discovery of the poison and the bead. Thane's eyes widened in shock and fury at the news of such profound treachery. For a moment, his hatred for the human was eclipsed by his rage at the traitor. Lysander held the bead out to his beta. Smell it. The pack scent is faint, but it is there. Tell me who it belongs to. Thane took the bead, his initial reluctance giving way to intense concentration as he brought it to his nose. He inhaled deeply, his brow furrowed. He growled low in his throat, a sound of dawning, horrified recognition. This scent. I know it, Thane snarled, his eyes flashing. Gavril. I've seen him near the northern border more than once in the last moon cycle. He claimed he was reinforcing the scent markers. He looked up at Lysander, his face a grim mask of certainty. The northern border is not our primary concern. It is, however, the border we share with the Shadow Moon Pack. The name of their most hated rivals dropped into the silence of the cave like a stone. The conspiracy was no longer just a traitor within. It was an act of war. Lysander's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Gavril, Lysander repeated, the name of venomous promise of retribution. So the Shadow Moons have finally grown bold enough to strike at my heart. The revelation hung in the air, thick with the promise of bloodshed, a traitor, an enemy pack, an act of war. While Lysander and Thane began to speak in low, guttural tones about how to capture Gavril without alerting the Shadow Moons, Isolde's mind was already racing ahead. Catching the traitor was one thing. Saving the pack was another. The poison was still in their water, still weakening the sick, and still a threat to the healthy. Capturing him is not enough, Isolde interjected, her clear voice cutting through their war talk. Both males turned to look at her, surprised by her interruption. We need to address the immediate threat, she continued, stepping forward and commanding their attention. First, the sick. They need a true antidote, not just the poultice I used on the king. The poison works slowly, but it is still in their systems. Second, the spring. We cannot allow another wolf to drink from it until it is cleansed. Lysander looked at her, his expression unreadable. What do you propose? Isolde's confidence grew. This was her domain. For the antidote, we need yarrow to purify the blood, and elderberries to bolster their strength. They grow in abundance by the western slopes. We can brew a large-scale tonic and make it mandatory for every pack member to drink. It will be bitter, but it will purge the last of the poison. She then turned her attention to Thane, whose skeptical glower had returned. For the spring, we need to neutralize the magical agent. Fire is a purifier, but we cannot risk boiling the source. Instead, we can quarry limestone from the cliffs. Crushed into a powder and poured into the grotto, it will absorb and neutralize the dark magic clinging to the water and the stones. We can have it clean and safe to drink within a day. She stood before them, not as a timid human, but as a commander laying out a battle plan. Her strategy was logical, efficient, and addressed the pack's survival on two fronts. She had considered their resources and devised a solution that used their own territory against the attack. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't hostile or shocked. It was considering. The Silverhound warriors who had begun to gather at the cave entrance, drawn by the urgent tones, murmured amongst themselves. They had heard her plan, and to their practical warrior minds, it made perfect sense. They looked at the small human woman with a new light in their eyes. Lysander watched her, a slow, proud smile touching his lips for the first time. He looked to his beta for a reaction. Thane stared at Isolde for a long moment, his expression a war of ingrained prejudice versus undeniable logic. The welfare of his pack was his highest priority, and her plan was the best, the only chance they had. He finally gave a single, sharp nod. "The human's plan is sound," he admitted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth, but ringing with sincerity. "It will be done." The pack moved with a newfound purpose. Under Isolde's direction, teams of wolves quarried limestone from the cliffs, their powerful claws sending showers of white dust into the air. Others followed her into the western slopes, gathering armfuls of yarrow and elderberries. For the first time since her arrival, the hostile growls were replaced by the sounds of work, a rhythm of unity against a common, unseen foe. Isolde moved among them, a strange human general in a war of healing, and felt the first fragile tendrils of acceptance from the pack. They were working near the grotto, preparing to pulverize the limestone, when a panicked howl echoed from the border. A moment later, 2 patrol scouts burst into the clearing. Their fur was ragged, and one had a deep slash along his flank. "They came under a banner of truce," the uninjured scout panted, addressing Lysander, who had been overseeing the work. "3 of them. They left this and retreated." He dropped a crude, black-feathered spear at his alpha's feet. Tied to the spearhead with a leather cord was a scroll of tanned hide. A tense silence fell over the clearing. Lysander's face hardened into a mask of cold fury as he untied the scroll. He read the message, his jaw tightening with every word. When he looked up, his golden eyes were burning with a lethal fire. "It is from Fenris," he announced, his voice dangerously calm. The name of the Shadow Moon Alpha was a venomous curse on his tongue. "He sends his condolences for my recent illness." The mockery was plain. "He suggests my strength has been permanently sapped, not only by sickness, but by the influence of a human witch who now poisons my mind instead of my water." Isolde flinched, and a protective snarl rumbled through the assembled Silverhounds. "Therefore," Lysander continued, his voice dropping to a low growl as he read from the scroll, "to prevent a prolonged and messy war between our packs, I, Fenris of the Shadow Moons, do issue a formal challenge of dominance. Alpha against Alpha. We meet at Silver Creek in 3 days' time. Your life for my claim over the Northern Territories. Refuse, and my pack will take them anyway, starting with the bones of your human mate." The ultimatum was a declaration of total war, wrapped in the guise of a formal challenge. It was designed to be inescapable. To refuse would be to admit weakness, destroying his standing among his own people and inviting attack. To accept, while still recovering his full strength, was a monumental risk. "You are not at full strength, my king," Thane protested instantly. "It's a trap." Lysander crushed the scroll in his fist, his decision already made. He lifted his head, and from his throat erupted a powerful, earth-shaking howl. It was not a sound of pain or fear, but of pure, unadulterated rage and unwavering defiance. The sound echoed across the valley, a clear and unmistakable answer to the Shadow Moon Alpha. The challenge was accepted. The next 3 days were a whirlwind of frantic preparation. While the pack sharpened their claws and drilled in combat formations, Isolde's work intensified. She brewed endless cauldrons of the antidote, ensuring every last wolf was purged of the poison's lingering effects. But her primary focus was Lysander. She created potent, strengthening tonics for him, using the rarest herbs in her collection to speed his healing and restore the formidable power the sickness had stolen. Lysander, in turn, refused to let her be a helpless bystander. "Fenris has made you a target," he stated one evening, his voice grim as he watched her grind herbs. You are the heart of this pack now, whether you accept the title or not. A leader must know how to defend themselves. And so, their training began. In the precious hours between her work and his war councils, he taught her. He showed her how to hold a knife, not like a villager carving bread, but like a warrior seeking a vital point. He taught her how to use a wolf's charge against them, to step aside at the last moment and drive an elbow into a vulnerable joint. He was a patient but demanding teacher, his large hands guiding hers, correcting her stance, his body often pressed close to hers. Each session became less about combat and more about a dangerous, electrifying intimacy. The professional alliance they had forged was rapidly deepening into a fiery, undeniable attraction. She saw the honorable male beneath the powerful king, and he saw the fierce spirit beneath the gentle healer. On the final evening before the battle, he was showing her how to break a wrist hold. "He will grab you like this," he said, his fingers wrapping around her arm. "You do not fight his strength. You use your other hand to bend the thumb back, sharply." Isolde followed his instruction, but she fumbled the move, her footing slipping on the damp earth. She stumbled forward, and Lysander, reacting with lightning speed, dropped the hold and caught her, pulling her flush against his chest to steady her. Her hands landed on the hard muscle of his torso, and her head was tilted back, her face just inches from his. The world seemed to stop. The sounds of the war camp faded into a dull roar. All she could hear was the frantic beating of her own heart and the deep, steady rhythm of his. The air crackled, thick with unspoken words and simmering desire. His golden eyes, darker now with an emotion she was beginning to recognize, burned into hers. "Isolde," he whispered, the sound a raw, aching prayer. He lowered his head, his lips parting slightly, closing the last impossible inch between them. Just as his lips were about to meet hers, a distant howl signaled the start of the final war council. The spell shattered. Lysander recoiled as if burned, a look of profound frustration on his face. He released her, putting a respectable distance between them, though the energy of the moment still hung in the air like a thick fog. "The council," he said, his voice strained. "I must go." He gave her one last, lingering look before turning and striding toward the main cavern, leaving Isolde breathless and trembling. She spent the next hour distributing the last of the strengthening tonics, her mind replaying the moment with Lysander over and over. She was so lost in thought that she didn't notice Thane approaching until he stood directly in front of her, blocking her path. His usual glower was gone, replaced by a complex expression of contemplation. "Healer," he said, his voice a low rumble. Isolde braced herself for another insult or a veiled threat. Instead, he simply watched her for a long moment. He had seen her tireless work, her brilliant stratagem to save the spring, and her unwavering dedication to his alpha. He had seen the way Lysander looked at her, and the way the pack was beginning to follow her lead without question. His ingrained prejudice had finally crumbled under the sheer weight of her actions. "My entire life, I have been taught that humans are weak, that they are driven by greed and fear," Thane began, his words slow and deliberate. "I was wrong. You have shown more courage and loyalty than many wolves I have known. You saved my king. You saved my pack." Isolde was too stunned to speak. Thane's expression hardened with resolve. He took a step back, and to her utter shock, he dropped to one knee before her on the hard-packed earth. He lowered his head in a gesture of profound respect and submission. "I was wrong to disrespect you," he said, his voice ringing with sincerity. "I am sorry." He then looked up, his golden eyes meeting hers, clear and resolute. "I, Thane, Beta of the Silverhound pack, swear this oath. I will protect you with my life. I will obey your commands as I obey the Alphas. I accept you, not just as our savior, but as our Luna." His oath, sworn in the heart of the war camp, cemented her place. He was not just an ally won. He was the key to uniting the entire pack behind her. As he rose to his feet, a scout, his fur matted with sweat and dirt, sprinted into the clearing, his eyes wide with urgency. He skidded to a halt before Thane. "They're here," the scout gasped, his chest heaving. "The Shadow Moons. They are massing at Silver Creek. Fenris leads them." The scout's words sent a jolt of electricity through the camp. The time for preparation was over. Warriors began to gather, their movements economical and grim. A low, rumbling hum of anticipation replaced the sounds of the evening. The fight was upon them. Lysander emerged from the main cavern, now fully clad for battle. He wore hardened leather armor across his chest and vambraces on his forearms, but his true weapons were the power and confidence that radiated from him. He was no longer the weakened king from the sickbed. He was the formidable alpha, his strength fully restored, his eyes burning with righteous fury. He addressed his pack, his voice a clarion call that cut through the tension, reminding them of their strength, their unity, and the treachery they were about to avenge. While the pack prepared to march, Isolde was in the healer's tent, a smaller cave near the den entrance, frantically organizing her supplies, bandages, tourniquets, and pain-numbing poultices. Her hands were steady, but her heart was a wild drum against her ribs. A large shadow fell over the entrance. It was Lysander. He entered the cave, and the space suddenly felt small and intensely private. He came to her, taking the bandages from her trembling hands and setting them aside. "Thane told me what he did," Lysander said, his voice soft. "He swore to you. The pack is united, Isolde, because of you." "I only did what any healer would do," she whispered, unable to meet his gaze. "No," he said, gently tilting her chin up so her eyes met his. "You did what a queen would do." He caressed her cheek with his thumb. "I was a fool to speak only of a bond, of destiny. It is more than that. I admire you, your strength, your fire, your mind. I am falling in love with you, Isolde." Tears pricked her eyes as the truth of her own feelings rose to the surface. "I am terrified," she confessed in a small voice. "Not of the Shadow Moons. I am terrified for you." "Then let me give you something to hold on to," he murmured. He leaned in and captured her lips with his. The kiss was not the desperate, hurried thing she might have expected. It was deep and powerful, a searing promise of a future, a vow of devotion given on the edge of a battlefield. It was everything left unsaid in their training, every spark of attraction, every moment of respect, finally given voice. It was the kiss of a king claiming his queen, and a woman finally accepting her king. They broke apart, breathless, just as the deep, resonant blast of a war horn sounded from the ridge, signaling the enemy's final approach. The battle had begun. The battlefield was a moonlit clearing bisected by the rushing, shallow waters of Silver Creek. On one side stood the Silverhounds, a silent, disciplined wall of silver-gray fur and grim determination. On the other, the Shadow Moons gathered, a chaotic mass of darker Mangier wolves, led by a brute of an alpha whose fur was the color of jet. There was no negotiation. With a guttural roar from Fenris, the Shadow Moons charged. The battle erupted in a tidal wave of snarling fury. The sounds of clashing bodies, snapping jaws, and enraged howls filled the night. Lysander moved like a silver phantom, a blur of speed and lethal grace. He ignored the lesser warriors, his golden eyes locked on his true target. He met Fenris in the center of the creek, the water exploding around them as they collided. Their duel was the heart of the storm, a whirlwind of claws and teeth, a brutal ballet between two kings fighting for dominance. Isolde watched from a protected ledge overlooking the creek, her heart in her throat. Thane stood before her like a granite wall, his massive form a shield against any stray shadow moon who might break through the lines. She was not idle. As the battle raged, she saw Shadow Moon warriors firing crude arrows from the tree line. When a Silverhound went down, clutching his leg, she saw the telltale blackish-purple discoloration spreading from the wound. "Poison!" she cried out to Thane. "The arrow tips are poisoned with nightshade." Thane relayed the information with a powerful bark. Isolde quickly directed the other healers, who were waiting with her. "Belladonna leaves. Chew them into a poultice and apply it directly to the wound. It will counteract the toxin." Her quick thinking and knowledge saved at least a dozen warriors from succumbing to the poison's deadly effects. Her eyes were constantly drawn back to the center of the fight. Lysander fought with the strength of a fully restored alpha, but Fenris was a brutal, relentless foe who fought with dirty tactics. As Lysander tore a gash in Fenris's shoulder, the Shadow Moon Alpha ignored the wound and lunged low, sinking his teeth savagely into Lysander's unarmored thigh. Lysander roared in pain, his leg buckling. He stumbled, and Fenris seized the advantage, slamming his massive body into Lysander's chest and sending him crashing backward into the shallow water. Isolde screamed his name, her hands flying to her mouth. Thane put an arm out, holding her back as she instinctively tried to rush forward. Lysander lay stunned in the creek, water swirling around him. Fenris stood over him, blood dripping from his maw, a triumphant, murderous snarl twisting his features. He raised his head in a victory howl, ready to lunge and deliver the final throat-tearing bite. Isolde's scream was lost in the chaos of the battle. She watched in abject terror as Fenris, the embodiment of brutal triumph, loomed over Lysander's fallen form. The Shadow Moon Alpha's victory howl was arrogant, a fatal mistake. He savored the moment for a heartbeat too long, anticipating the kill. That heartbeat was all Lysander needed. In a breathtaking explosion of silver fur and churning water, Lysander erupted from the creek. He wasn't stunned. He had been waiting, using his opponent's bloodlust against him. He lunged upward, not at Fenris's throat, but at his forelegs. With a sickening crunch of bone, he shattered Fenris's front leg, sending the larger wolf crashing into the water with a yelp of agony. Before the Shadow Moon Alpha could recover, Lysander was upon him, his teeth sinking deep into the traitor's neck. The fight was over in a single, decisive act of retribution. As Fenris's lifeblood stained the waters of the creek crimson, a stunned silence fell over the battlefield. The remaining Shadow Moons, seeing their alpha fall, lost all will to fight. Some surrendered, dropping to their bellies in submission. Others fled into the darkness of the forest. The battle was won. The Silverhounds let out a triumphant, unified howl that shook the very trees. But Lysander did not join them. He rose from the creek, his silver fur matted with mud and the blood of his enemy, his injured leg causing him to limp heavily. His gaze swept over the battlefield, over the cheering warriors and the defeated foes, and found Isolde on the ledge. Ignoring everyone else, he began to walk toward her. He limped through the carnage, his path direct and unwavering, his golden eyes never leaving her face. He was a king returning from war, a primal force of nature, and he was coming for her. He stopped at the base of the ledge, and the pack parted for him as he climbed. He stood before her, a terrifyingly beautiful sight in the moonlight, the scent of battle still clinging to him. The entire pack, both Silverhound and the remaining Shadow Moon captives, watched in silence. Isolde's heart hammered against her ribs. Then, he did the unthinkable. Lysander, the victorious Alpha King of the Silverhound pack, slowly, deliberately, knelt before her. He lowered his proud head, placing himself at her mercy in front of the entire world. He looked up at her, his golden eyes blazing with an emotion so raw and powerful it made her ache. "Isolde," he said, his voice ringing with devotion. "When I first claimed you, it was the instinct of a possessive wolf. Now I reaffirm that claim with the heart of a man." He reached out, taking her hand gently in his own. "I do not claim you as a prize. I vow myself to you as your partner. your protector, your king. I vow you my love, my life, and my loyalty for all the days to come. Be my Luna, be my queen, please." His plea hung in the moonlit air, a raw and beautiful testament. Isolde looked down at the Alpha King kneeling at her feet, his fierce pride laid bare as an offering to her. She saw the faces of his pack watching them, their expressions no longer hostile, but filled with a hopeful, reverent awe. She saw Thane, his staunchest enemy, standing guard over her with unwavering loyalty. In that moment, all her fear, all her anger at being claimed, melted away, replaced by a profound, overwhelming love. This was no longer a cage. This was a home. She had not been taken from her life. She had been led to it. She had arrived as a frightened healer, an outsider. But in the heart of this wild, dangerous world, she had found her own strength. She had faced down suspicion, uncovered a conspiracy, and commanded the respect of warriors. She was not the same woman who had opened her cottage door to a desperate wolf. A serene smile touched her lips. She looked at Lysander, this magnificent king who offered her his world, and knew her answer with absolute certainty. Slowly, she gathered the hem of her simple dress and knelt before him, mirroring his posture. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. A human, kneeling to an alpha, was expected, but for her to do it now, when he was the one pleading, was a gesture of immense power. It was an act of equal partnership, a queen meeting her king on level ground. She reached out, her hands gently cupping his face, her thumbs stroking his scar-roughened cheeks. "Lysander of the Silverhounds," she said, her voice clear and strong, resonating with an authority she never knew she possessed. "I have seen the honorable soul beneath the fearsome king." She leaned forward, her forehead touching his. "As you are my king, I am your healer. As you are my shield, I am your strategist." She pulled back slightly, her gaze locking with his, sealing their fate. "And as you are my mate," she whispered, "I am yours." She claimed him in return. With a soft cry of joy, Lysander surged upward, meeting her halfway. He captured her lips in a deep, searing kiss, not of desperate passion like before the battle, but of profound, triumphant love. It was a seal on their vow, a promise made before gods and wolves. Around them, the Silverhound pack erupted. They threw their heads back, and a single deafening howl of celebration rose into the night sky. It was a sound of victory, of joy, and of unanimous, thunderous acceptance for their new Luna. In the week that followed the battle, a new era began for the Silverhound pack. The defeated Shadow Moons were dealt with. Their pack absorbed under Lysander's firm but just rule. Their old alpha a grim memory. The traitor, Gavril, was brought to justice. But the final act of healing was yet to come. On the 7th day, Isolde, now moving with the quiet confidence of the Luna she was born to be, led a procession into the forest. She walked at the head of the pack beside Lysander, whose leg was healing swiftly under her expert care. Behind them, strong warriors carried heavy sacks of crushed limestone. They were not marching to war, but to perform a ceremony of renewal. When they reached the grotto, the place still held a faint, sickly aura from the poison's dark magic. The water in the spring, though no longer being actively tainted, remained stagnant and corrupted. Isolde addressed the assembled pack. "This spring is the heart of our home," she announced, her voice carrying easily in the quiet clearing. "It was poisoned by our enemies to weaken us, to break our spirit. Today, we cleanse it. Together." Under her direction, the ceremony began. She had the warriors form a circle around the grotto. At her signal, they began to pour the white limestone powder into the tainted pool. As the powder hit the water, it hissed and fizzed, a visible reaction as the alkaline limestone neutralized the acidic, magical poison. The iridescent film on the surface dissolved, and the dark, murky water began to churn. Isolde knelt at the edge, placing her hands into the fizzing water. She closed her eyes, not speaking a spell in any known tongue, but focusing her own innate, healing energy, the deep knowledge of life and nature that was her gift, into the spring. She felt the dark magic recoil from her touch, dissolving like smoke. She felt the life force of the water begin to stir again, pure and clean. Lysander knelt beside her, placing his large, warm hand over hers in the churning water. He added his own alpha strength to her healing, a silent, powerful partnership. Around them, the pack watched in reverent silence as their human Luna and their alpha king worked in tandem, their combined strength washing away the last remnants of the shadow moon's treachery. After a long while, the hissing stopped. The water settled, and for the first time in weeks, it ran perfectly clear, bubbling up from the earth with renewed life. The dying moss around the edges seemed to regain a hint of its color. The cleansing was complete. Isolde looked at Lysander, a radiant smile on her face, their hands still joined in the pure, cool water. It was the dawn of their new reign, born from a shared act of healing and renewal. Months passed. The harshness of winter melted into the vibrant, tender green of a new spring. The Silverhound territory thrived under the joint rule of its Alpha and Luna. The union with the submissive shadow moons had strengthened their numbers, and the memory of the poison was now just a story told to pups to remind them of their Luna's wisdom. Isolde stood on the high ledge overlooking the valley, the same ledge where she had once watched a battle for their lives. A gentle breeze ruffled her hair, and she wore a simple, elegant tunic embroidered with the silver sigil of the pack. She was no longer just Isolde the healer. She was Isolde, Luna of the Silverhounds, and the title felt as natural as her own skin. As she watched the pack below, warriors training, mothers nursing pups, the life of their people unfolding peacefully, a sense of profound contentment filled her. Strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and she leaned back into the solid warmth of Lysander's chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his presence a familiar comfort. His leg had healed completely, leaving only a faint, silvery scar. "What does my queen see?" he murmured into her hair. "I see a home," she replied softly. "I see a strong, healthy pack. I see a future." She turned in his arms to face him, her hands coming to rest on his chest. "Do you ever regret it? Choosing a human mate?" He smiled, the expression transforming his fierce, kingly features into something deeply tender. He leaned down and kissed her softly. "My only regret is all the years I lived without you." He looked out over their lands, his golden eyes filled with pride and love. "You did more than heal my body, Isolde. You healed my pack. You showed us that strength is not just about claws and teeth, but about wisdom, courage, and a compassionate heart." He pulled her closer, and they stood together, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. The uneasy truce that had once defined the border between her world and his was gone, replaced by a bond forged in fire, poison, and unwavering love. The human healer who had been summoned to save a dying king now stood as his beloved queen, their two hearts beating as one. They were the Alpha and his Luna, and they ruled a world they had not just saved, but had remade together.